1987. American businessman Donald Trump and his wife, Czechoslovakian model Ivana, pose on Palace Square in then-still Leningrad. Trump came to the USSR with a very ambitious goal: to purchase land and negotiate with the Russians to build a hotel in the center of Moscow or Leningrad. Or maybe it was the other way round. Trump came to be bought by the Russians from the KGB. Well, if we were fans of clickbait sensationalism and pyramid schemes, we would say so without hesitation. But fortunately, you're watching the Explaining Base channel. In this video, we will recall everything we know about the 47th President of the United States to try to answer the question, is Trump a friend or foe of Ukraine? First, admit it. Trump's statements make you feel irritated, angry, confused, and misunderstood, and sometimes you even laugh, more like hysterically. After his inauguration on January the 20th, 2025, you hear him talk about Ukraine almost every day and often think, how could he even say that? Is he working for Putin? Then you see his photo with Zelensky in the Vatican and the news that the US is helping to find additional Patriot systems, and you say, Trump has come to his senses, Putin has played his hand. Then a new day dawns and a new statement from the American president, and everything starts all over again. Trump is a very complex politician, perhaps the most complex the world has faced in the last few decades. However, in addition to Trump's personality, Ukrainian diplomats have to contend with Russian influence, which is influencing the American president. This is not just speculation or a nice turn of phrase, but a real fact confirmed by journalistic research. According to Bloomberg analysis, Donald Trump has repeatedly taken a public stance in favor of Russia's position on Ukraine. Journalists analyzed more than 300 public statements made by Trump between August 2024 and mid-March 2025. They also analyzed more than 3,000 social media posts made on behalf of the US president and those by members of his administration. The period in which this analysis took place saw Trump's most radical statements before he toned down his rhetoric slightly in April. For example, the day after Trump and Putin spoke on the phone on February the 12th, the American president said that Ukraine's desire to join NATO was the reason for the war. Then a week later, talks between the Americans and the Russians took place in Riyadh. Immediately after them, Trump called Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator without elections. If two cases can still be called a coincidence, here is a third example that highlights the pattern. On April the 11th, Trump's special representative Steve Witkoff met with the Russian dictator, and a few days later the US president said the Ukraine had started the conflict with Russia. Is this Trump's permanent position? Well, of course not. Volodymyr Zelensky confirms that even a 15-minute conversation with Trump was enough for him to better understand Ukraine and accept our position. We do not seek to justify the US president, nor do we accuse him of direct cooperation with Russia against Ukraine. Instead, let us recall the history of Trump's relations with the Russians with a cool head and facts. We assure you that they are interesting, diverse, and very long-standing. So long-standing that they began back in the Soviet era. Trump's trips to Russia. In 1986, experienced Soviet diplomat Yuri Dubinin arrived in New York to work at the UN. According to his daughter, during their trip around the city, they saw Trump Tower. The diplomat apparently liked the building so much that he wanted to meet its owner, so Dubinin met Trump, whom he quickly and easily won over. The Russian said that the World Trade Center was the first thing he saw in the city. Dubinin's daughter recalls that these words had the same effect on the flattery-hungry billionaire as honey to a fly. Trump describes the circumstances of his acquaintance with Dubinin quite differently. He claims that he met the Russian in the same year when they allegedly happened to be next to each other at a dinner. At the time, Dubinin already had the status of the USSR's ambassador to the US. This meeting did indeed take place, but was it the first? The versions don't match. However, both sides do agree that it was at that dinner that the future US president agreed with the Soviet ambassador on his visit to the USSR. As the American recalls in his book, The Art of the Deal, he looked at several potential sites for a hotel that did not reach any agreements. The reason was that Trump wanted to buy land for real estate, and Soviet law didn't allow this, although the businessman claims that the Russians were very keen to sign an agreement with him. Not even the Soviet press wrote about this visit, so the only result of Trump's trip to Moscow and Leningrad was personal photographs. Whether the businessman had any other contacts in Moscow besides business ones is a matter of speculation. Some believe that the KGB could not have failed to monitor such a prominent guest, given that Trump was staying at the Hotel National in the center of Moscow, and in the room where Lenin himself once lived. But there is a big difference between surveillance and recruitment, and there is no evidence that Trump did indeed become a Russian agent. Trump visited Moscow again after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1996, he came to discuss the construction of a residential complex and, once again, a hotel in the Russian capital. Trump met with Moscow Deputy Mayor Vladimir Resin, who offered the businessman an opportunity to invest in the renovation of existing hotels, as he had done 10 years earlier. Donald Trump declined. But Trump would not be Trump if he had so easily rejected the idea of cooperation with the Russians. A year later, he returned to Moscow with a new, incredible project. The businessman proposed to Russian-Georgian sculptor Zurab Tsereteli to create a huge statue of Christopher Columbus to be erected in Manhattan. The grandeur of the idea is evidenced by the fact that the monument was to be no smaller than the Statue of Liberty. However, Trump was again met with disappointment. Trump's only truly successful project in Russia was the Miss Universe pageant. Trump himself owned the pageant and had long sought an opportunity to hold it in Russia. Azerbaijani Russian oligarch Aras Agalarov and his son Emin helped the American businessman realize his idea. They agreed to finance and organize the event at Moscow's Crocus City Hall. In addition, Donald Trump praised Ukraine for the first time during a conversation with Ukrainian TV presenter Katerina Osadja. Trump arrived in Moscow in November 2013 and made no secret of his desire to meet Putin in person. He even sent the Russian dictator a letter inviting him to attend the pageant finals and wrote on Twitter, "Do you think Putin will come to Miss Universe? If so, will he become my new best friend?" Putin did not show up, but sent Trump a gift and a letter, the contents of which Trump revealed. During the show, Trump boasted on American television that he has a relationship with Putin and the Russian president is very interested in what is happening at the contest. These statements were exaggerated. They did not meet in person, but Trump clearly wanted to give the impression of closeness to the Kremlin. Trump and Russian money of doubtful origin. Although the meeting with Putin did not take place, the events of 2013 marked a new high point in Trump's relations with representatives of Russian business. These relations began in the 2000s when Russians actively invested in Trump's real estate. This was facilitated by the numerous trips of Trump's children to Moscow, where they held talks with local entrepreneurs. In 2008, Eric Trump said that Russian money then accounted for a significant share of the Trump's family business. At the time, there were many questions about this money, and the problem was not only its Russian origin. For example, in 2008, Russian oligarch Dmitry Robolovlev bought a plot of land in Palm Beach, Florida, from Trump. The Russian paid a record $95 million for it, even though Trump had bought the land for half the price 4 years earlier. Even taking into account that the plot could have risen in value, its estimated value at the time of purchase was approximately $65 million, which is also significantly less than the amount paid. Only 10 years after the deal was signed did the U.S. Senate take notice. American officials suggested that Trump and Robolovlev could have been laundering money, but the matter never went beyond talk. The Robolovlev case is not the only episode in Trump's career when his ties to Russians have raised questions about legality. Since 2005, he's done business with Bayrock, a company founded by Russian-Turkish developer Tevfik Aref. They jointly built the Trump Soho Hotel in New York and worked on a hotel project in Moscow. The businessman's cooperation ended when journalist Tim O'Brien published an investigation. He claimed that Bayrock had received money from Russian organized crime. How did the story unfold? In 2010, former Bayrock CFO Jody Criss even filed a lawsuit against his former employer. He claimed that the company was secretly run by the mafia, committed fraud and laundered money. As a result, Trump had to testify in court where he said that he hardly knew Aref and other Bayrock executives. Trump enters politics and praises Putin. All these scandals and dubious ties to Russians did not prevent Trump from entering politics, and, as it turned out later, they may even have helped him in some ways. but more on that later. Since 2014, Donald Trump's statements have become more politicized. He began to use Russian aggression in Ukraine to criticize his political opponents. But Trump did not demand a tougher stance on this issue from then US President Barack Obama. No, he used the situation to tell Americans and the world that Putin is a strong leader who makes good decisions while Obama is not. This thesis was not new to Trump. Since 2007, he had praised Putin's leadership, intelligence, and his activities as president of Russia. However, against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, these words began to sound strange, to say the least. In addition, Trump rejected any criticism of the Russian dictator. For example, when journalists asked him how he could praise Putin when he kills and imprisons his opponents, Trump replied that this also happens in the US. After such statements, Trump firmly established himself as, if not a pro-Russian candidate, then at least a Kremlin sympathizer. But the politician did not shy away from this at all. During his election campaign, he repeatedly emphasized that he wanted to have good relations with Russia. Even when his opponent, Hillary Clinton, said that Trump wanted to be friends with Putin, Donald replied without embarrassment, "What's wrong with that?" It seems that Trump was not only unafraid of being labeled pro-Russian, but even sought to prove that he deserved it. In July 2016, the politician stated that Crimea should be with Russia and that, if elected, he would consider recognizing the peninsula as Russian and lifting sanctions for its annexation. It cannot be ruled out that this was another manifestation of Russian influence on the American businessman and politician. After all, Trump had long-standing contacts with Russia and could well have adopted their views on events. And his campaign manager, Paul Manafort, had previously worked for disgraced Russian puppet Viktor Yanukovych. How Russia helped Trump in the 2016 election. Remember how he said that Trump's contacts with Russians not only did not harm his political career, but even contributed to his victory in the 2016 election? It is a proven fact that Russians interfered in the US elections, including through cyber attacks. At the same time, according to the findings of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, there was no direct collusion between Trump and the Russians. But an important note, there was no legally proven collusion. This does not mean that Trump or his associates had no contact with Russians at all. According to the New York Times, Trump and at least 17 people from his circle had about 100 contacts with Russians during the election period. The most egregious case of Russian involvement was a meeting at Trump Tower in June 2016. At that time, Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, met with Natalia Veselnitskaya, a Russian lawyer with close ties to the Kremlin. The meeting was organized by Emin Aglarov, who had known Trump since the Miss Universe pageant. He approached Trump Jr. with an offer to provide compromising information on Hillary Clinton, and the politician's son did not refuse. The Russians, of course, did not do this for no reason. Therefore, after the election victory, but before Trump's inauguration, his national security advisor Michael Flynn met with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak to discuss the lifting of sanctions against Russia. Flynn lied to the FBI that this meeting did not take place. As a result, he was brought to court where he pleaded guilty. Trump initially defended his subordinate but later backed down. But ultimately, the 45th President of the United States pardoned Flynn in 2020. Trump's disgrace in Helsinki. Donald Trump took office as US President in January 2017 and did not change his rhetoric towards Russia and Putin. The official also avoided any criticism of the Russians and made statements in their favor. Trump really got carried away in 2018. At the G7 summit in Canada, the US president told his colleagues that Crimea belongs to Russia by right, simply because Russian is spoken there. He also began to question support for Ukraine. Trump asked the members of the G7 why they had sided with a corrupt country, namely Ukraine. In addition, he tried to raise the issue of Russia's return to the G7. White House communications staff somehow managed to soften this episode, saying that these were private conversations. But a month later, a real reputational disaster struck. In July 2018, the Russia-US summit took place in Helsinki, where the two presidents met in person. Trump, who had constantly criticized his opponents for weakness in comparison to Putin, was clearly at a loss during his meeting with the Russian dictator. At the summit, he looked like Russia's junior partner, while Putin gave the initiative and did not raise any important issues. The worst began at a press conference when Trump was asked what, in his opinion, Russia was guilty of. There was plenty to choose from because during Trump's presidency, the Russians continued to behave like crazy terrorists. They interfered in elections, bombed Syria, waged war in Ukraine, and carried out a chemical attack in Salisbury. However, Trump did not mention any of this and limited himself to a general statement. We are all guilty of something. When Trump was asked directly about interference in the elections, he said that Putin had assured him of his non-involvement and that Trump had no reason not to believe him. But there were reasons. US intelligence confirmed the interference. Trump effectively said that he trusts the Russian dictator more than American institutions. Even his fellow party members couldn't defend this. Respected Republican Senator John McCain called Trump's comments one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. He criticized Trump for defending a tyrant, repeating his talking points and not standing up to him. Trump's relations with Russia are far from ideal. Trump really sounded like a host of a political show on Russia 1. This made everyone expect him to make real decisions in favor of Russia, lift sanctions against Russia and impose them on Ukraine, or repaint the White House in the colors of the Kremlin. In 2016-2017, Trump whipped up public sentiment with pro-Russian rhetoric to such an extent that it would not have surprised anyone. But we're talking about Trump, a man of unpredictability who actually teaches us all a very valuable lesson. We must evaluate not only words but also actions, and the reality was as follows. Trump's previous administration did not in any way help Russia and sometimes, on the contrary, made decisions that were hostile to the Kremlin. This once again highlighted the paradoxical nature of the American president. In 2017-2018, Trump imposed further large-scale sanctions against Russia and, following the Skripal poisoning, expelled 60 Russian diplomats from the US, more than any other country. The Russians responded in kind. There were even more radical actions. In 2017, the Trump administration sold lethal weapons to Ukraine for the first time, providing Ukrainians not only with Javelins, but also with an epic meme. Trump still mentions the transfer of Javelins when he claims that no one has been tougher on Russia than he has. Of course, the US president, as always, exaggerates his achievements, but there is some truth in his words. In 2018, Trump was not afraid of maximum confrontation with Russia. At that time, US troops dealt a devastating blow to the Wagner private military company in Syria, killing approximately 200 Russian militants. The Russians swallowed this silently, as is usually the case when they are met with force. The Trump administration also continued the course of strengthening NATO's eastern flank begun by its predecessors. For example, it increased funding for the European Deterrence Initiative. This program was launched in 2014 by the White House, a few months after Russia's attack on Ukraine. The program's goal is to increase the US presence in Europe and strengthen the defense capabilities of countries bordering Russia. With the same goal in mind, Trump rotated US troops in Poland and the Baltic states. In 2019, Trump even approved the opening of a military base called Fort Trump in Poland. Although the project has not been finalized, the move was welcomed by Eastern European allies and criticized in Moscow. Russian generals called the build-up of US troops a provocation. Incidentally, Polish President Andrzej Duda said in February 2025 that Fort Trump would be completed. Trump was tough in his decisions. In December 2019, approving sanctions against companies building the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Criticizing Germany for its dependence on Russian gas, Trump dealt a painful blow. Moscow had long relied on gas as a hybrid weapon. The sanctions halted construction of the gas pipeline until 2021, when Joe Biden eased them. The behavior of Russian propagandists is proof that relations between Trump and the Kremlin are far from ideal. We all understand that they have no option of their own and only voice what they are told to say. You probably remember how propagandists frantically shouted, "Trump is ours," after his victory in 2016. The euphoria quickly faded when Trump failed to live up to Russian expectations. Since 2017, propagandists have been mostly neutral or negative about Trump. They have not hidden their disappointment and have said that the American president is no different from his predecessors. Here is what Russia's Channel 1 propagandist Anatoly Kuzychev said in 2019. "Yes, we regret it. We regret that it was all just words. Yes, we rooted for Trump, I can confirm that. We behaved like fools who naively believed a bunch of words. Gradually, Russian propaganda found itself in a bind. On the one hand, Putin did not want to quarrel, realizing that he could not find a more friendly US president. But on the other hand, he had to explain to his audience why the promised friendship had not materialized. As a result, two narratives coexisted in the Russian media. Trump wants to be friends, but he's being prevented from doing so. And Trump is no better than anyone else because he deceived us. Trump through Putin's eyes. Putin himself never criticized Trump publicly, but he also did not shower him with verbal syrup in response, as the American president did. He first took notice of Trump only during the Americans' election campaign. Putin made no secret of the fact that he liked this candidate's statements and looked forward to restoring relations with the US. In general, the dictator was stingy with compliments and usually referred to Trump as a bright and talented person. This characterization is more suited to a showman than a politician, and it speaks volumes about Putin's perception of Trump. Putin limited himself to this. He did not show any friendliness towards Trump and did not make any concessions to him when he took office. But there was plenty of Putin's trademark toxicity. When asked in 2017 if he was disappointed with Trump's actions, Putin replied, "Trump is not my fiancé and I am not his fiancé, so I cannot be disappointed." Their personal communication was even more toxic. According to former Trump advisor Fiona Hill, who was present at the meeting between the presidents, Putin openly mocked Trump. Hill knows Russian, so she recognized the sarcasm in Putin's words, but the interpreter avoided the sharpness of the remarks, so Trump did not understand that he was being mocked. Hill cited several examples of Putin's mockery. During the conversation, the Russian dictator told the US president about hypersonic missiles. Trump enthusiastically said, "Oh, I'd love to have them," to which Putin replied, "Yes, yes, of course you'll get them." The interpreter conveyed these words without a hint of sarcasm, so Trump didn't notice anything. The US president then said that no one had done more for Israel than he had, to which Putin sarcastically replied, "You're doing great, Donald. Maybe Israel should name the country after you." The interpreter again missed the ironic tone. Trump, not understanding the trolling, replied quite seriously, "No, that would probably be going too far." This dialogue was hardly unique. Putin most likely always communicated with Trump in this style. Hill claims that after meetings with the Russian, Trump ignored the advice of his aides and refused to analyze transcripts of the conversation. Therefore, the US president may not even realize that Putin is mocking him. As for Putin, despite some disappointment in Trump, he still supports him, although this is less obvious than it was before. Before the last US presidential election, Putin emotionally stated that he did not care who won. In his opinion, US policy towards Russia would not change, and then he sarcastically supported Kamala Harris. When Trump won, the Russians put the old record back on, saying that Trump would bring order to the US, that he would definitely leave Ukraine alone, and that Russia would have a chance for constructive dialogue. So can we say unequivocally whose side Trump is on? It's easy to understand the Kremlin's henchman, but after his election victory, Trump's rhetoric cannot fail to please the Russian authorities. He is once again praising Putin, criticizing US allies, and taking steps that are pleasing to Russia. For example, he's waging a trade war with other countries, threatening to withdraw from NATO and reducing the American contingent in Europe, and eliminating soft power instruments such as USAID. And of course, he often expresses a position on Ukraine that satisfies the Kremlin. But is this a cause for concern? If you compare Trump's rhetoric during his first term and now, it's not very different. In some places, it's even got worse. During Trump's first term, he was surrounded by at least some professionals who balanced his impulsiveness. Now he's surrounded himself exclusively with loyal people. As a result, alternative opinions are increasingly rare in the 47th president's administration. He makes just as many promises to Russians and at the same time fails to take any decisions that are positive for them. And in Ukraine's relations with the US, despite all the difficulties caused by Trump's ego, he listens to other people's opinions. He can be persuaded to make decisions in our favor. This is the result of the painstaking work of Ukrainian diplomats and the methodical presentation of Ukraine's position to the Trump administration. That is why the US unblocked military aid and intelligence sharing and finally signed an agreement on subsoil resources on terms that no longer look like reparations or bondage to us, but more like a normal partnership. If Trump had been incapable of dialogue, the document would not have been reworked countless times, and the initial conditions he insisted on would have remained unchanged. We discussed this agreement in detail on our channel. After the agreement was signed, the Trump administration softened its stance towards Ukraine somewhat. Recently, the US State Department announced the sale of critically important equipment for F-16s to Ukraine worth $310 million. And in the statements for the 47th president, irritation with Putin's behavior in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war sometimes seeps through. For example, Trump called on Putin to stop after another missile strike on Ukraine. Earlier, he told American journalists that he was very angry with the Russian leader for questioning the legitimacy of Vladimir Zelensky. This surprised everyone because Trump had always avoided such rhetoric towards Putin. At the same time, we cannot deny the fact that Trump is very friendly towards Putin and Russia in general. The American president wants to communicate with Putin, be on equal terms with him, and most likely appreciate certain traits of the Russian dictator. Back in 1990, Trump reflected on his political future and said that as president he would be tough and rely on military superiority. In this context, he stated that Russians are much tougher than American officials, but he added that he would not trust the Russians if he were in office. So, who is Trump really? We can only say with certainty that Trump is the most impulsive and emotional politician of our time. Predicting his decisions is like trying to guess what number will come up on dice. You know what numbers are on the dice, but you can't know for sure what the result will be. No one knows who he will play in favor of tomorrow. Perhaps he will move Lenin's mummy, which he liked in 1987, to Trump Tower. Or maybe he'll give the Ukrainian armed forces tomahawks with a request to bomb that disgusting mausoleum that ruined his appetite in 1987. Trump's thoughts and decisions are like Brownian motion. Every assessment of his behavior will be fair in its own way. But is it worth taking something that you can turn 180 degrees in an instant so close to your heart? You know the answer yourself.